I knew something was wrong the moment the cable rose from the water with nothing attached, yet still shaking like something was clinging to it just beneath the surface. Working as the crane operator on a remote oil platform is dangerous enough, but nobody warned me about the 11 rules we must follow if we want to make it off this place alive. I remember the first time I broke one, and the way the ocean seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. These rules aren't reminders. They're warnings carved from whatever happened to the people before us. And last night, I realized why one rule matters more than all the others, and why it might already be too late. I learned the meaning of Rule 1. Never lift anything from the water if the cable feels heavier than it should. During my first true night shift, when the ocean around the platform looked more like a single unblinking eye than a body of water, I was alone in the crane cabin, hands resting on the cold metal controls while the cable lowered steadily into the black below. The deck lights barely reached the waves, leaving most of the sea hidden in a silence that felt almost intentional. I kept telling myself I wasn't nervous, but my breaths were too slow, too controlled, like my body was trying not to draw attention. Even then, before anything truly went wrong, I could feel the weight of that rule pressing into me. The platform always felt different at night, but that particular evening carried a heaviness that had nothing to do with the weather. There was no wind, no movement, almost no sound except the constant hum of machinery beneath my feet. The air tasted metallic, like old batteries, and every corner of the deck looked darker than it should. I kept glancing through the cabin window, expecting to see someone walking across the platform, but nobody did. Every worker had retreated inside earlier than usual, claiming they were tired, though their eyes said something else entirely. They didn't want to be outside after sunset. The cable sank deeper, and I watched the tension gauge as if it could explain the strange tightness in my chest. The crew warned me that the ocean here behaved in ways we weren't meant to question, but I chalked that up to offshore paranoia. Now though, with the cabin trembling under my boots, I wasn't so sure. The gauge flickered once, then steadied. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to determine whether it had been a glitch or something more. Part of me hoped it had been my imagination. Part of me hoped it wasn't. I checked the radio, expecting Torres to call in the depth reading, but the line remained silent. That silence started stretching too long, like it was waiting for something else to fill it. I pressed the transmit button and asked for confirmation, but no one responded. A cold pressure ran up my spine, as if someone had placed an invisible hand between my shoulder blades and pushed. I turned slightly, even though the cabin door was locked behind me. Nothing was there. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was standing just out of sight. The first hint that the hull was wrong came from the cable itself. The tension needle moved again, only slightly, but in a way that didn't match the depth. The water was calm, the equipment steady, and the load should have felt light. Instead, the gauge began to climb, slow and stubborn, as if something below had wrapped itself around the steel line. I hesitated, unsure whether to halt the operation or call for backup. The rule echoed in my thoughts, louder than the engine hum, but softer than a whisper. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that I was overreacting, that this was just another shift. The platform had a way of twisting your senses, especially at night. Torres finally answered the radio, his voice strained in a way I didn't recognize. He said the sonar picked up interference beneath the hook, something large that hadn't been there minutes earlier. He tried to describe the shape, but the static swallowed half his words, leaving only fragments that shouldn't have gone together. I asked whether I should halt the lift, but he hesitated long enough that I understood he didn't know. That hesitation frightened me more than anything he might have said. Torres was never unsure. I tapped the controls lightly, feeling the vibration travel up through the metal like a pulse. The tension gauge climbed another fraction. The cable shouldn't have felt heavy yet. The hook hadn't reached the target depth. Something below was increasing the weight. My throat tightened with a quiet dread, a kind that settles in before you have time to question it. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but part of me already knew what the rule meant. It wasn't about equipment safety. It wasn't about avoiding excess pressure. It was a warning about something else. When I looked back out the window, the waves around the platform had changed. They looked too smooth, as if some invisible sheet had been placed over the water, hiding whatever moved beneath it. I leaned closer, squinting at the faint ripples circling outward from where the cable entered the sea. They weren't natural. They spiraled in directions that didn't match the wind or current. The ocean seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding like a vast, slow heartbeat. My fingers tightened around the control lever, despite myself. The cabin lights flickered once, dimming for just a breath, and I froze. The darkness outside suddenly felt thicker, almost waiting. I looked around the small room, feeling for the first time like I was being observed. It wasn't the paranoid sensation of isolation. This felt directed, intentional, as if something beyond the steel walls had decided to focus on me specifically. The cable jerked slightly, not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough to make me step back involuntarily. Whatever was below was not part of our operation. My instinct screamed at me to stop the lift immediately, but training, or maybe pride, held me in place. I pressed the transmit button again and asked Torres if his screen still showed interference. His answer came after a delay, and his voice was lower than before. He said the interference was rising, following the cable upward as if tracking it. He asked whether I felt anything unusual through the crane controls. I didn't answer right away. I didn't have to. The silence between us said more than words. The tension gauge climbed again, sharper this time, and I watched in disbelief as the numbers jumped in small but steady increments. Something was definitely attached. Something that shouldn't have been there. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, like the air had tightened around me. I couldn't look away from the water. I expected it to break at any moment, for something to emerge, but the surface remained deceptively calm, too calm. I hovered my hand over the emergency halt, unsure whether I was reacting too early or too late. The rule thundered in my head again, not as a reminder but as a warning. I imagined the veteran operators who had drilled it into the newcomers, the tension in their voices when they spoke. Now I understood their fear. This wasn't superstition, this was survival. The cable shuddered sharply, and for the first time I heard the platform groan beneath me, a deep metallic strain, as if something below was trying to pull us downward. My breath caught. I could no longer pretend this was equipment failure. The sea had become too quiet, too deliberate, and every instinct in me screamed that lifting whatever was down there would be a mistake I wouldn't recover from. I reached for the emergency stop, but before I touched it, the water below the hook stirred, not violently. Subtly, like something enormous was adjusting its grip. The ripples tightened into a slow spiral, drawing inward toward the cable. Torres suddenly shouted through the radio, telling me to halt the operation immediately, but his voice dissolved into static halfway through. I didn't need to hear the rest. My hand slammed the emergency button. The crane locked up with a heavy jolt, and the tension gauge froze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the weight began to drop, as if whatever was holding the cable was releasing it reluctantly. The entire platform vibrated under my boots. The water's spiral loosened, spreading outward in an unnatural, controlled pattern, like something slipping back beneath the surface. I stepped away from the controls, heart pounding, unable to tear my eyes from the dark below. The cable rose slightly, unburdened again, and the sea returned to its stillness, but I knew what I felt through the metal. Something had been there, something vast, something curious, and I knew it would come back. Even as the adrenaline from the previous night's incident slowly faded, I remembered Rule 2. Always secure the hook with the secondary latch before adjusting the load, because I was about to lift something unfamiliar from the dark water again. The morning fog hugged the platform like a damp shroud, and the sea below was deceptively calm, hiding whatever lurked in its depths. I kept my hands on the controls, thinking about how the first rule had nearly ended me, and tried to convince myself that this time, I could follow the rules perfectly. My mind, however, was already replaying the slight tug on the cable, the way the water had moved around it, almost deliberately. Even the veterans avoided talking about it, as if naming the incident would summon it again. Torres joined me in the cabin this morning, his eyes red from lack of sleep, and muttered something about the water being restless. I didn't respond, just tightened my grip on the lever. I had seen the same unease in the other crew members' faces yesterday, but no one dared voice it out loud. The secondary latch was a simple mechanical safeguard, but its importance was drilled into every newcomer. Even if it seems unnecessary, never bypass it, the old operators had told me. Now gripping the lever, I understood why it wasn't about equipment. It was about what you couldn't see waiting below. Lowering the cable again, I checked the secondary latch, hearing the subtle click as it engaged. The platform seemed unusually quiet, the hum of machinery almost drowned out by the unnatural calm around us. I had expected waves, the slap of water against the hull, but nothing moved except the cable itself. I couldn't see what might be clinging below, and every instinct told me that the sea was not as empty as it appeared. The lesson from the first night was fresh. Underestimate the water at your own peril. As the hook descended, I felt the subtle changes in tension through the control lever. My eyes darted to the gauge, then back to the rippling surface. I could almost sense the current below, something large moving, yet invisible. I considered the incident from yesterday, and the terror that had tightened my chest, the twitch in the cable, the unnatural spirals in the water. Secondary latch engaged. I whispered to myself, as if saying it aloud could anchor me, give me control. The air in the cabin felt thick, almost alive, as though it too were holding its breath with me. Torres leaned closer, trying to see what I could see. Does it feel different? He asked quietly, the words carrying the weight of fear. I nodded slightly, unsure if he could feel the same tension I did through the cable. Something was there, waiting beneath the water, and the secondary latch was the only thing keeping it from pulling the crane and me into its reach. I thought about the other operators who had refused to lift unknown loads, their faces pale, voices tight. They knew, even if they didn't say, that the latch wasn't just a mechanical safeguard, it was a lifeline. The hook sank further, the tension creeping ever so slightly upward, though the water remained calm. I reminded myself of the latch again, ensuring it hadn't shifted. The cable vibrated faintly, almost as if a creature below were testing it, tugging gently but persistently. My pulse raced, every nerve on edge. I tried to reason with myself that this was just physics, that currents, or an unseen snag, were causing the tension. But nothing in the gauge readout suggested any irregularity beyond the subtle weight creeping upwards. Still, the feeling in the pit of my stomach said otherwise. Torres' voice broke through my thoughts again. Are you sure it's secure? He asked, eyes fixed on the lever. I took a deep breath and confirmed the secondary latch, feeling the metal click lock firmly. It's secure, I said, though my voice was tighter than I intended. The silence that followed felt heavier, as if the sea itself had paused, anticipating the lift. I remembered Rule 1, how close I had been to disaster, and I knew the secondary latch wasn't just a precaution. It was the difference between surviving and being pulled into something I couldn't hope to understand. The water around the cable seemed to react subtly, forming almost imperceptible eddies that weren't consistent with the wind or tide. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on following every safety protocol. The secondary latch held firm, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe the danger might be avoided this time. But the gauge twitched again, more insistently than before, and I realized that nothing this deep behaved predictably. The ocean had a patience that no human could match, and whatever was down there was testing me, probing every line of defense I could muster. I felt the lever shudder slightly under my grip, the cable humming with tension, and I couldn't tell if it was mechanical or something more. Torres's unease was mirrored in my own thoughts. I could feel the unspoken dread between us, a shared understanding that the ocean didn't play by normal rules. The secondary latch clicked once more, as if reassuring me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay below was aware of every small movement I made. My hands were clammy on the controls, my eyes darting between the gauge and the endless black of the water. Lowering the hook further, I noticed a faint glimmer beneath the surface, a shift in color, a shadow that wasn't quite a shadow. My stomach twisted. The secondary latch was the only thing preventing catastrophe, and yet I felt helpless against the vast unknown below. I whispered to myself again, almost a mantra, secondary latch engaged, hoping repetition would anchor me. The waves remained suspiciously still, the machinery's hum steady, but the subtle vibrations through the lever betrayed the presence of something enormous, moving quietly beneath. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Every microsecond of movement through the crane's controls demanded my full attention. Every twitch in the cable, an urgent signal to act. The water below began to ripple, forming tight concentric circles that radiated outward, as though the sea was drawing patterns meant only for me to see. I couldn't understand it, couldn't predict it, but the secondary latch held firm, preventing the pull from being transmitted directly to the crane. My knuckles were white, sweat running down my temple, yet I couldn't look away. I remembered stories from veteran operators about the deep watching, how sometimes the ocean itself seemed sentient. I had scoffed until last night, until the cable vibrated under my fingers like a living thing. Now, with the secondary latch secured, I still felt the presence beneath the waves, patient, calculating, probing. The metal lever thrummed faintly in my hands, mirroring my pulse. I whispered quietly to Torres, "Whatever it is, it knows we're watching." He didn't answer, staring at the water, frozen. Suddenly, the cable twitched violently for a split second, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to make my heart jump. My eyes went to the gauge, then back to the water, then down to the secondary latch. It had held. The cable quivered in place, like a living appendage testing the air. I realized then how much I relied on that simple piece of metal. Without it, the hook and I would have been at the mercy of something vast, something patient, something intelligent. Rule 2 wasn't about machinery, it was about survival. I had just finished double-checking the secondary latch when the words of Rule 3, "Never look into the water directly after sunset," forced themselves into my mind, sharper than any warning I had heard before. The horizon had turned a bruised purple, the kind that makes the sky feel like it's bleeding into the sea. Even with the platform lights casting their feeble glow, the water beyond was a dark mirror that seemed to stretch into infinity. I kept my eyes from wandering toward it, reminding myself why the rule existed, though curiosity gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I had learned from the first 2 rules that the ocean here wasn't just deep, it was intelligent, patient, and aware of every twitch of our machinery. As the sun slipped completely below the horizon, the platform's lights seemed to lose their strength, barely reaching the edges of the deck. Torres sat beside me, his gaze fixed on the instrument panels, though I could sense his unease. We had both felt the subtle pull from the previous lift, the way the water had clung to the cable, as if testing us. Now the darkness made the sea's intentions impossible to read. I reminded myself silently of Rule 3, knowing that breaking it could be the last mistake I ever made. Yet even as I obeyed, my eyes kept flicking toward the water's surface, drawn by some invisible force. The crane's lever vibrated faintly beneath my fingers, a gentle reminder of the weight we were managing. Below the surface, I imagined the same spirals and eddies from the previous night, moving slowly and deliberately. The platform had been quiet for hours, and every tiny reflection or shimmer in the water drew my attention, almost forcing me to glance despite the rule. I could feel my pulse quicken as I fought the temptation, knowing that once I broke this particular boundary, I might see something I could never unsee. Rule 3 was less about equipment or mechanics. It was about the ocean itself, and how it could claim attention, curiosity, even sanity. I glanced at Torres and noticed that his hands were trembling ever so slightly. He had learned the rules before me, yet the darkness had a way of unnerving even the most experienced. "Keep your eyes off it," I whispered, more to steady myself than to instruct him. He nodded without looking, the tension in his shoulders betraying his effort to comply. The ocean below waited, a patient predator, and we both knew that observing it directly after sunset was not just dangerous, it was provocative. My mind raced with possibilities of what might be lurking just beneath, some form enormous enough to have tested our previous lifts with near precision. The gauge showed no unusual tension yet, but the cable seemed to move with a subtle independence, reacting to currents I couldn't see. I reminded myself that the secondary latch was holding everything in place, that Rule 2 had saved us, and that now Rule 3 demanded my attention in a new, more abstract way. Even the water's surface, smooth and silent, felt deliberate, like the reflection itself was hiding something enormous and alive. I felt my throat tighten, the words of the earlier warnings echoing in my mind. The ocean was patient, and it did not forgive curiosity. Minutes passed, and the shadows along the platform's edges grew longer and darker. I refused to look down, keeping my focus on the crane's readouts and the instrument panels. Yet a tiny part of my mind constantly drifted toward the water. I imagined eyes below, vast and unblinking, studying me in return. I thought of the operators who had come before me, who had vanished or gone mad, and I realized that Rule 3 wasn't about what you could see. It was about what could see you in return. The silence around us became almost oppressive, pressing in on my ears and chest. Torres finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, eyes fixed on the gauges. I nodded, though I couldn't explain precisely what it was. The water had a rhythm, a slow pulse that matched my own heartbeat. I knew that if either of us looked directly, the rhythm might synchronize with something larger, something beneath the surface that we weren't prepared to confront. Rule 3 wasn't just caution, it was a shield, a thin barrier between awareness and total vulnerability. The thought made my stomach twist. The hook wavered slightly as I adjusted the crane, keeping my movements deliberate and precise. The water around the cable darkened even more, a shadow within a shadow, and I felt my body tense instinctively. The rule flashed through my mind again, a warning I couldn't ignore: never look into the water directly after sunset. I had followed it so far, but the urge to glance over the edge was almost magnetic. My eyes darted toward the reflection, catching just the faintest shimmer before forcing themselves back to the panels. The tension between curiosity and survival was suffocating. Hours seemed to stretch as the night deepened. The cable maintained its weight, the secondary latch held firm, but the water's surface became almost liquid darkness, hiding motions I couldn't detect, but could feel. My muscles ached from tension, my palms slick with sweat. Every instinct screamed that the ocean was aware of our scrutiny, tracking every micro movement of the crane and our bodies. The lesson of Rule 3, I realized, was psychological as well as physical. It trained the mind to resist the pull of the unknown, and in this place, resisting was everything. Torres shifted uncomfortably beside me, finally breaking the silence. "It's like it's waiting," he said. I didn't respond, only nodded slightly. The hook remained steady, the gauge's numbers calm, but the air in the cabin felt heavy, thick with unspoken threats. We both understood that the rule wasn't arbitrary. We could follow the mechanics perfectly, yet still fall prey to the simple act of looking. The ocean had a way of claiming those who disobeyed, of drawing them into its depths mentally, before anything physical occurred. Survival was about discipline. I forced myself to focus, telling myself that as long as my eyes remained on the instruments, we were safe. Yet the darkness beyond the platform's railing seemed alive, moving in subtle ways that defied normal currents. My heartbeat raced, and I kept repeating Rule 3 in my mind like a mantra, a tether keeping my sanity intact. The ocean's surface shimmered faintly, as if reacting to something unseen, and I realized that disobeying the rule could be more than fatal. It could reveal truths we weren't meant to know. The idea made my chest tighten, and my stomach knot with anticipation. By the middle of the night, fatigue weighed on both of us, but we maintained vigilance. The crane operated smoothly, yet I felt the ever-present weight of the unknown beneath us. I reminded myself that Rule 1 had been about the initial lift, Rule 2 about securing the hook, and now Rule 3 demanded restraint of the mind as well as the body. I dared not look into the water, dared not even imagine what might be observing us, but the fear never left. It lingered in every shadow, every faint ripple, every breath of cold air that seemed to drift upward from the deck. Somewhere beneath the surface, I knew something waited patiently, testing us with subtle cues, unseen pressure, and the quiet vibration of the crane cable. I resisted the urge to glance over the edge, knowing that the moment I did, the ocean might decide to take notice in a way I could not anticipate or survive. Rule 3 had transformed from a simple directive into a lifeline, a fragile barrier that kept the mysteries of the deep from reaching me directly. The night stretched onward, infinite in its darkness, each passing minute a test of will. Hours later, the first faint hint of dawn began to press against the horizon, painting the water with muted color. Even with light returning, the lessons of the night remained etched in my mind. I had survived, obeyed Rule 3, and felt the weight of the ocean's patient scrutiny lessen slightly. Yet I knew that night was just one trial in a sequence, that the rules were cumulative, and that the deep had not yet revealed its full intentions. Obedience had preserved me for now, but I understood that each rule was a layer of protection, and breaking any one could be catastrophic. The night had barely ended when I felt the lingering unease pressing against my chest. And Rule 4, never ignore unusual movement on the platform, no matter how small, came sharply to mind as I stepped onto the damp deck. The lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the metal grates, and I noticed the subtle sway in one of the cranes, even though no wind blew. My eyes scanned the area instinctively, tracing every imperceptible shift, every flicker of motion that might have gone unnoticed before. Even Torres, who had grown quiet after obeying the previous rules, gave a slight nod, sensing the same tension vibrating across the platform. There was no room for oversight here, not with the ocean watching. I began walking toward the other side of the deck, careful to track each sound, each vibration beneath my boots. The platform was alive with small, almost imperceptible movements that could easily be dismissed by an inattentive eye, yet I felt their significance in my bones. I recalled the stories the senior operators whispered in the control rooms: strange shifts in machinery, unexplained tremors, objects moving without reason, all dismissed as the quirks of age and metal. But now, having felt the pull from the water in the last 2 nights, I knew that nothing unusual could be ignored. Every twitch might be a warning, a signal, or a trap. Torres followed silently, his face pale under the harsh glare of the deck lights. "Did you see that?" he muttered, gesturing toward the far edge of the platform, where a small hatch seemed to wobble slightly. I squinted, trying to convince myself it was just the metal contracting in the cold, but the movement repeated, subtle yet deliberate. My pulse quickened. The rule wasn't about machinery, it was about observation, awareness, and survival. Ignoring something so small, so trivial in appearance, could be fatal. I gripped the railing, letting my senses extend beyond the visible, into the rhythm of the platform itself. The previous nights had taught me that the ocean below affected everything above, not directly, but in patterns that were almost invisible, unless you paid attention. I walked slowly, scanning the floor plates for inconsistencies, checking cables for unusual vibrations, and monitoring the cranes with heightened focus. Every small movement, every deviation from expected mechanical behavior, registered in my mind as potentially significant. Rule 4 had never felt more alive, more urgent. The platform was not just steel and machinery, it was a living entity in dialogue with the ocean, and ignoring its subtle signals could have consequences beyond comprehension. At the crane cabin, I noticed the hook's shadow on the deck, swaying slightly, though the cable tension seemed normal. I frowned, trying to reconcile what I saw with what I felt. Torres watched quietly, his eyes darting between the hook, the hatch, and the instruments. "It shouldn't move like that," he whispered, almost reluctantly, as if acknowledging the anomaly might draw attention. I nodded, aware that even a whisper could fracture the fragile calm of the night. The rule echoed in my mind, a mantra now, Never ignore unusual movement on the platform. No matter how small, it was not optional. It was a lifeline, and the subtle shifts of metal and shadow demanded respect. As the hours stretched on, I walked the length of the platform, noticing things I would have dismissed during the day. A railing that seemed slightly off-kilter, a ladder that creaked under no weight, a hatch that didn't align properly with its frame. Each anomaly felt deliberate, a signal I was expected to read. The ocean below was patient, and the platform above mirrored its patience, conveying warnings in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. My senses were stretched taut, my attention unwavering. Even a tiny lapse in vigilance felt dangerous, as if the water itself might exploit the smallest oversight. Torres and I took turns monitoring the cranes, while the other inspected the deck. Each small step, each careful observation, heightened the tension, making every imperceptible vibration significant. I realized that the anomalies weren't random. They were patterns, messages. The subtle swaying of a hook, a hatch that shifted minutely, a plate vibrating slightly out of rhythm. These were communications from the platform, or perhaps the water itself. Ignoring them was not an option. The rule had been drilled into me, and now I understood that the ocean's intelligence extended to everything it touched. At one point, I approached the far end of the deck, where a crane arm seemed to twitch with a rhythm I couldn't attribute to mechanics. I froze, staring, calculating, trying to determine if my eyes were deceiving me. I felt Torres's presence behind me, his silent observation matching my own heightened awareness. The platform seemed to breathe with subtle motion, responding to the water, the wind, and our own actions. Ignoring the movement was impossible, and acknowledging it felt like the first step toward understanding something incomprehensible. Every decision mattered, every observation could determine survival. The night deepened, the horizon blackening further, and the platform's small anomalies became a symphony of subtle, deliberate movement. Each time I noticed something unusual, I paused, studying it, trying to interpret whether it was dangerous or merely mechanical. Rule 4 had transformed from a simple caution into an ongoing exercise in survival awareness. I understood, more fully than ever, that the platform itself was alive in conjunction with the deep, communicating through these small, often ignored signals. My heart pounded with each discovery, each twitch of metal, each subtle ripple of shadow, knowing that neglect could be fatal. Hours passed, and fatigue pressed against me, but the vigilance demanded by Rule 4 never relaxed. I moved deliberately, measuring each step, each glance, each adjustment to the crane. The anomalies persisted, some almost imperceptible, others too deliberate to ignore. I understood that the ocean tested us not with brute force alone, but through patience, through subtle signals that required constant attention. To survive here, one had to perceive the imperceptible, respond to the unnoticed, and never dismiss the small movements that could betray a much larger danger lurking nearby. By the early morning, the subtle shifts had begun to stabilize, but the lesson of the night remained. Rule 4 had reminded me that the platform itself could be as dangerous as the ocean beneath it. Every small twitch mattered, every tiny movement was part of a larger pattern. Ignoring any of them could have drawn consequences we weren't prepared to confront. The weight of the rule pressed on me, not like a suggestion, but like a constant reminder that the platform and the ocean were interconnected, and that survival depended entirely on observing, acknowledging, and respecting the smallest deviations from the expected. The first light of dawn barely touched the horizon when I remembered Rule 5. Always check the winch before releasing any unknown load, and my hands instinctively went to the machinery that had betrayed so many operators before me. The platform seemed almost serene under the pale glow, but I knew better. The ocean had a patience that made the calm deceptive. Torres hovered nearby, silent, eyes scanning the same winch I had learned to treat with both respect and fear. Every cable, every lever, every moving part could conceal danger, and the memory of the previous lifts weighed heavily on my mind. Obeying the rule wasn't just procedural, it was survival. I approached the winch cautiously, my palms damp despite the chill in the air. Each gear, each pulley seemed ordinary, but my instincts told me otherwise. There was an intelligence to the water below, an unseen force that extended its reach to the platform, and the winch was the boundary between us and its power. The previous nights had demonstrated how easily a simple oversight could escalate into peril. Rule 5 was drilled into me, not just as a precaution, but as a safeguard against the unknown, a tangible measure of control over forces I couldn't see but could feel. I checked the mechanism slowly, deliberately, as if the ocean could sense impatience. Torres leaned over my shoulder, pointing to a small discoloration on one of the pulleys. "That wasn't there yesterday," he said quietly, his voice carrying a tension that matched my own. I examined it, realizing that even a tiny anomaly could affect the release of the load, creating a risk far greater than we could manage. The ocean's intelligence had a way of revealing itself in these subtle changes. Ignoring them could be catastrophic. My fingers traced the winch's surface, checking for resistance, misalignment, and tension. Each movement methodical and precise, aware that any miscalculation could invite disaster. I ran through the checklist mentally, ensuring every lever, gear, and cable was secure. The ocean below was invisible, yet palpably present, each ripple echoing through the platform like a heartbeat. I could feel the weight of unseen forces, testing the mechanisms, probing for weakness. The winch was our first line of defense. Rule 5 demanded vigilance that went beyond simple mechanics. I imagined the worst-case scenario, the cable snapping, the hook pulling unexpectedly, a load tearing free into the darkness. My chest tightened with anticipation as I reminded myself that any oversight could have consequences we couldn't escape. The morning sun began to rise, painting the deck in faint gold, yet the shadows between the machinery seemed longer than light should allow. Every pulley, every rotating gear, felt alive under my touch, vibrating subtly, almost intentionally. The ocean's patience was mirrored in the movement of the winch, each rotation a quiet warning. Torres and I moved slowly, deliberately, checking connections, pulleys and cables repeatedly. Rule 5 demanded attention, not just to the mechanics, but to the relationship between the platform and the sea. Each turn of a gear could change the balance, could provoke forces that were patient yet immensely powerful. We lifted the first test load, a crate of standard supplies, but the winch responded with a tension that felt off, subtle but undeniable. I froze, recalling the previous night's lessons, the invisible force beneath the waves that tested every movement. The crate moved slowly, but the cable vibrated as though something below it had brushed against the hook. I reminded myself silently of Rule 5, checking the winch again, ensuring the load could not slip, could not pull the crane toward the unknown. The ocean had a way of teaching lessons slowly, but thoroughly, and disobedience or oversight carried immediate consequences. Minutes stretched into hours as we tested the winch under different loads, each time feeling the subtle pressure from the deep, as though something enormous was tugging gently at our vigilance. I could sense the patience of the water, the intelligence in the darkness, observing each movement with intent. The secondary latch held firm, the crane responded, but the winch required constant attention. Rule 5 was no longer a formality. It was the difference between maintaining control and surrendering to forces we could not see or comprehend. I imagined the stories of operators who had ignored this step and vanished without trace. As the day progressed, the sky brightened, but the tension remained. Every turn of the winch was deliberate, slow and precise, each adjustment measured against the unseen weight below. Torres kept close, silent now, both of us aware that Rule 5 demanded absolute focus. We exchanged glances occasionally, neither speaking, both knowing that even the smallest misjudgment could invite disaster. The ocean below was patient, intelligent, and relentless, capable of exploiting a moment's carelessness in ways we could never anticipate. I felt every vibration, every subtle shift, like a pulse reaching through the steel of the platform into my own body. By mid-afternoon, The routine of checking the winch had become a test of endurance. Each movement required calculation, observation, and unwavering attention. I noticed the cable vibrating in a pattern inconsistent with the weight, and my mind raced to evaluate whether this was mechanical or something else. Rule 5 demanded I act before uncertainty became danger. I adjusted the tension, checked the secondary latch, and watched the gauges like a hawk, aware that ignoring even a minor anomaly could have irreversible consequences. The ocean's patience mirrored our own. Any misstep could trigger a reaction we weren't prepared to survive. We moved to lift the next load, a container that had been stored for weeks. The winch groaned slightly under the strain, subtle and easily dismissible, but Rule 5 demanded attention to these nuances. I adjusted the hook, tension, and alignment repeatedly, ensuring every component was perfect. The cable twitched unexpectedly, yet nothing on the gauges indicated an anomaly. I could feel the intelligence below testing us, pushing boundaries, measuring reactions. Torres remained silent, tense, his eyes following each minute shift. Rule 5 had transformed from instruction to lifeline, guiding every movement, every decision, every breath on the platform. Hours passed without further incident, but the ocean's presence was unrelenting, palpable even in the brightest daylight. The winch became a conduit for the unknown, a boundary between what we could control and the intelligence waiting beneath the waves. I could feel the pull, subtle but unmistakable, like a finger tracing the edge of our consciousness. Every load we released, every adjustment we made, reminded me why Rule 5 existed. Not for efficiency, not for protocol, but for survival. The weight of responsibility, the tension of vigilance, pressed against my chest continuously, refusing to let me relax, reminding me that the ocean watched always, patiently, silently, and with intent. The moment I stepped back from the winch, the memory of Rule 6, never leave the crane unattended when a load is in the air, hit me like a cold wave, sharper and more urgent than any previous warning. The deck glistened with the faint remnants of the morning's condensation, but the water beyond remained an endless dark void, full of patience and threat. My hands itched to stay on the controls, to feel the subtle feedback through the lever that told me everything the ocean and the platform were hiding. Leaving the crane, even for a moment, felt like abandoning the thin line between survival and disaster, and the lessons of the previous nights had made this instinct unavoidable. Torres lingered beside me, his eyes flicking to the suspended load, a container that now seemed heavier than its weight suggested. The secondary latch clicked reassuringly under my fingers, but I could feel the tension in the cable, a subtle pulse that made the steel hum in resonance with my own heartbeat. I imagined what might be waiting below, unseen, testing our vigilance as always. Rule 6 demanded constant attention, a dedication that went beyond mechanical safety into something almost existential. The crane was no longer just a tool, it was a lifeline, and leaving it unattended could unleash forces we could not withstand. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the deck and whispering against the metal supports. Even with the platform's isolation, every tremor, every vibration carried meaning, and I kept my eyes locked on the load, scanning for inconsistencies in the hook, cable, or tension gauge. I thought about previous operators who had taken their eyes off the crane, dismissing subtle warnings, and I shivered. The ocean below had a way of testing patience and discipline, and every small lapse could magnify into catastrophe. Rule 6 was not just a procedure, it was a principle built on survival, carefully instilled into anyone who worked here. Hours passed with the load suspended, and every slight sway, every micro-adjustment of the cable became a potential message. The crane responded under my hands with an almost sentient smoothness, the metal vibrating faintly, as if echoing the patience and weight of the deep beneath us. I could feel Torres observing me, his posture tense, fingers brushing against the railing. Neither of us spoke, words felt unnecessary in the presence of such concentrated vigilance. Rule 6 echoed in my mind, not as repetition, but as a living instruction, guiding every movement, every shift of weight, every breath taken while the load hovered above the abyss. At one point, I imagined leaving the crane for a moment, just to stretch my stiffened back, but Rule 6 stopped me cold. I could not, would not, allow even the briefest lapse. The ocean's gaze seemed to follow me across the deck, invisible yet undeniable, and the suspended load became more than metal. It was a threshold between what I could manage and what might consume us. Every micro vibration, every whisper of metal against metal, demanded my attention. I felt the pulse of the ocean through the cable, subtle but insistent, as if warning me that leaving the crane would be catastrophic. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the water in bruised oranges and purples, but the deep beneath remained unfathomable, hiding movement and intelligence that no human eye could discern. I leaned into the crane, adjusting the cable slightly to compensate for wind and tide, each movement calculated and deliberate. The load above became a constant weight, not just physically but mentally, tethering me to a rule I could not break. Rule 6 demanded total dedication, and I could feel the consequence of even a momentary distraction pressing against the edges of my mind. Torres's voice finally broke the silence. "You've got eyes on it the whole time?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. I nodded, my gaze fixed, every sense tuned to the suspended weight. We had both learned the hard way that the ocean below and the platform above were not forgiving of negligence. The rule was as much about psychology as mechanics, instilling an unwavering vigilance that no operator could abandon without paying a high price. The load hung like a pendulum, tied not just to steel, but to every lesson, every warning we had received since arriving. I adjusted the crane slightly, feeling the subtle change in tension and movement, noting how the load shifted just enough to remind me that the abyss was aware. My palms gripped the controls, my back stiff, but I did not move away. The ocean's patience was mirrored in the hovering container, and the rule echoed in every decision I made. Each second away from the controls could unravel everything. Every tremor in the cable reminded me that even a simple mistake, a glance elsewhere, a step aside, could cost far more than I was prepared to pay. Rule 6 was absolute. The sky darkened further, the horizon bleeding into the water, and every shadow across the deck seemed alive. I could feel the platform vibrating subtly beneath my boots, a resonance that mirrored the tension in the cable. Rule 6 was a mantra now, guiding each motion, each breath, each calculated adjustment. I imagined what might happen if we allowed the load to swing freely, if we left the crane unattended, even for a heartbeat. The thought was unbearable. The weight of responsibility was enormous, stretching across metal, steel, and water alike. Hours melted into each other as I maintained my focus, eyes fixed on the gauge, the cable, and the suspended load. I could feel Torres beside me, equally tense, his presence a silent reminder that we were both bound to Rule 6. The ocean beneath waited, patient, measuring every action, every lapse, every micro twitch of the crane. Even a momentary lapse in vigilance could allow forces beyond comprehension to intervene. I gripped the controls tighter, feeling the cable hum faintly, a subtle echo of something alive below, a reminder that we had no margin for error. By the middle of the night, the suspended load had become a physical extension of my consciousness. Every tremor, every subtle shift, every micro-rotation of the hook carried potential danger. Rule 6 demanded complete, unbroken attention. The ocean's presence was unmistakable, its patience absolute, and the consequences of leaving the crane even briefly unimaginable. My mind stretched taut with focus, every sense alert to the faintest irregularity, knowing that the smallest mistake could pull the line between survival and catastrophe into the abyss. I hadn't even lifted my eyes from the cable when the faint glow at the edge of the water caught my attention. And Rule 7 never touched the bioluminescent creatures. If they appear near the platform, hit me with immediate urgency. Tiny, pulsating lights floated just beneath the surface, moving in eerie synchronization like living constellations that belonged to a sky beneath the waves. My first instinct was to reach toward the edge, curiosity gnawing at me, but the rule stopped my hands cold. I had already seen what happens when you underestimate the ocean's subtle intelligence. And these lights, beautiful as they were, carried danger I couldn't afford to ignore. Torres shifted beside me, his gaze locked on the glowing forms, fascination and fear warring in his expression. "Do they follow us?" he whispered, barely audible over the hum of the platform. I nodded slowly, knowing the answer before I even said it. The lights moved deliberately, circling the crane's base as if testing boundaries, aware of our presence. Rule 7 wasn't just about avoiding physical contact. It was about understanding the creature's awareness, their intelligence, and the consequences that came with breaking the most basic boundary. One wrong move, one impulsive touch, and the balance keeping us alive could collapse. I traced their movement carefully, making sure my hands didn't stray from the controls. The glow reflected off the metal surfaces, painting the deck in ghostly streaks, and my mind struggled to remain calm. The secondary latch held firm. The cable tension was steady, yet the creature's presence added a new layer of unease I couldn't ignore. They seemed to react to the slightest motion, pulsing brighter when the crane shifted even subtly. It was a silent communication, a warning, and I understood that breaking Rule 7 could trigger consequences far beyond anything mechanical or predictable. Hours passed with the creatures circling closer, their pulsating lights weaving a hypnotic pattern across the water's surface. I resisted the urge to reach toward them, reminding myself of the last operator, who had thought a brief touch harmless, only to vanish beneath the waves. Rule 7 echoed in my mind, a mantra now, keeping my fingers off the crane railing, even as the lights brushed unnervingly close. Torres muttered occasionally, speculating on the creature's purpose, but I kept my responses minimal, aware that acknowledging them too loudly might provoke more than curiosity. The ocean had a patience that extended to these beings, and disobedience carried weight. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of salt and something unidentifiable, and the creatures responded, forming tight clusters that pulsed in perfect harmony. I could feel a tension rising through the deck, the subtle vibration of the platform, syncing with the rhythm of the glowing forms. Rule 7 had taught me to respect boundaries, to treat the bioluminescent beings as entities with intention rather than decoration. My pulse raced, and I realized how fragile our survival was. The ocean, the platform, and these mysterious lights were intertwined, each demanding awareness, patience, and restraint. Torres finally broke the silence. "They're mesmerizing," he admitted quietly, eyes fixed on the water. I couldn't disagree, but I reminded him and myself of the consequences we'd seen whispered about. Those who disobeyed Rule 7 didn't return, or worse, return changed, hollowed by the deep. The creatures were beautiful, yes, but the beauty hid something ancient, something aware. I maintained a tight grip on the crane, observing the glowing forms without reaching out, knowing that one careless movement could turn fascination into disaster. The lights seemed to shimmer in anticipation, aware of our restraint, measuring our discipline. Minutes stretched into hours, the glow continuing its quiet dance around the crane's base. Every time I adjusted the load or glanced toward the winch, the creatures pulsed slightly brighter, almost as if acknowledging my vigilance. The ocean itself seemed to pulse in concert with them, reinforcing Rule 7 in a subtle but undeniable way. I realized that survival here was not about force or speed. It was about patience, observation, and respect. Even the smallest misstep, stretching a hand too far, leaning over the edge, could invite consequences that neither the platform nor the rules could contain. The air grew colder as night deepened, and the lights hovered just beneath the surface, their movements deliberate and patient. I felt the same tension as in previous nights, a constant awareness that the deep below and the beings near the surface were connected in a way humans could barely comprehend. I repeated Rule 7 silently, grounding myself in its importance. Never touch the bioluminescent creatures if they appear near the platform. The rule became more than instruction. It was a survival protocol, a barrier against the unknown intelligence below that could reach out through the glowing forms if provoked. I adjusted the crane slightly to ensure the load remained stable, feeling the faint vibrations of the cable echo through my arms. The creatures responded instantly, pulsing in rhythm with the tension, reminding me that even indirect interaction could carry consequences. Torres and I moved in silent coordination, eyes fixed on gauges and water, hands steady, resisting the hypnotic pull of the lights. Rule 7 demanded discipline beyond mechanics. It demanded mastery over fear and curiosity, the twin instincts that had claimed so many operators before us. I understood now that the creatures were more than natural phenomena. They were sentinels, measuring every action. Hours dragged into the deep night, the bioluminescent forms forming arcs and spirals that defied logic. I kept my gaze firm, resisting any impulse to lean closer, and found that patience was the only thing that allowed me to maintain composure. The platform itself seemed alive with subtle movement, responding to the pulse of the creatures, creating an intricate dialogue between the metal and the water. I realized that Rule 7 wasn't just about physical contact. It was about maintaining the boundaries between our world and theirs, and understanding the thin line that separated safety from disaster. As the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the creatures retreated slightly, pulsing more softly, almost respectfully. The tension on the deck remained high, the crane load secure, yet the lessons of Rule 7 had left their mark. I knew that even a fleeting lapse could have catastrophic consequences. The ocean, the platform, and the bioluminescent beings were interconnected, and obedience to Rule 7 had preserved our lives, at least for now. Every moment spent following this rule had reinforced the fragile balance, a reminder that in the deep curiosity could kill, and restraint was survival. I had barely exhaled after ensuring the bioluminescent creatures stayed at a safe distance, when the console's red warning lights flashed. And Rule 8, never override the platform's automated depth limit, surged into my mind with urgent clarity. The crane's controls resisted slightly under my hands, as if echoing the warning embedded in the steel itself. Below us, the dark water seemed thicker than ever, pulsating with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing against the metal deck. I reminded myself that the ocean had a patient intelligence, and tampering with its boundaries, even unknowingly, could unleash consequences beyond comprehension. Rule 8 wasn't just about mechanics. It was a lifeline against the unknown forces lurking beneath. Torres stood beside me, glancing at the monitors with tense eyes, his fingers hovering over the override switch that could push the crane past its programmed safety limits. "We could pull it up faster this way," he murmured, uncertainty lacing his tone. I shook my head firmly, remembering every operator story we'd heard, those who ignored Rule 8 and paid the ultimate price. The ocean didn't tolerate impatience, and the platform itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the unseen pressure below. Obeying the rule wasn't a suggestion. It was a command from the deep, a restraint that kept us tethered to survival. The warning lights blinked intermittently, a quiet insistence embedded in the console, yet the urge to push beyond was almost tangible. I imagined what lay below, some form of intelligence assessing us, measuring our restraint and patience. The platform's automated limit was our safeguard, a threshold we could not afford to test. I adjusted the controls slowly, deliberately, resisting the impulse to force the load past the warning line. Rule 8 anchored me, a mental and physical checkpoint that reminded me the ocean's depths were not ours to command. Every tremor of the cable, every vibration in the deck, reinforced the need to obey. Hours passed with the crane moving in slow increments, each meter measured, each adjustment intentional. The water beneath seemed to pulse, responding to our restraint, and I could feel the subtle pressure against the platform that mirrored our compliance with Rule 8. Torres remained silent, his gaze fixed on the monitors, aware that the moment we disregarded the safety protocols, we could provoke the unknown intelligence below. The lesson of patience stretched taut across the deck, a tension I could feel in my shoulders, chest, and even in my jaw. The ocean was patient, but it observed constantly, and Rule 8 kept us in a delicate balance. As the day shifted toward evening, the light dimming over the endless expanse, the cable's tension seemed almost alive, responding to hidden currents beneath the platform. Every movement had to be precise, deliberate, and within the automated safety parameters. Rule 8 became not just a precaution but a constant focus, guiding every turn of the winch, every adjustment to the load. I could feel Torres's eyes on me, sharing the silent acknowledgement that we were operating on a razor's edge, and even the smallest lapse could tilt the balance between survival and catastrophe. The ocean seemed to respond to our restraint, as if aware that we were adhering to its imposed limits. Small waves lapped gently against the platform supports, and yet the water below seemed denser, almost aware of every micro-movement we made above. I could sense a presence, something patient and immense, lying in wait beneath the deep blue, watching our adherence to Rule 8. The crane's resistance to my hands felt almost conscious, an unspoken collaboration between human caution and the ocean's intelligence. We had learned that disobedience was never tolerated lightly. At one point, I imagined testing the limit, pushing the crane a few extra meters beyond the automated line, just to see what would happen. My gut tightened instantly, reminding me of the vanished operators and their mistakes. Rule 8 reverberated through my thoughts. The ocean below would not forgive hubris. I pulled back immediately, adjusting the cable slowly within the programmed constraints. Torres exhaled softly beside me, eyes never leaving the gauges. We both understood that even small defiance of the rule could have far-reaching consequences, triggering events we weren't equipped to survive. The sky darkened further as night approached, and the water reflected the last hues of sunset, bruised and restless. Every vibration in the cable, every micro-movement of the hook, felt significant, imbued with warning. Rule 8 dictated our pace, enforced by both mechanical restriction and an unspoken recognition of the ocean's sentience. I adjusted the crane slowly, deliberately, resisting the impulse to rush, aware that even a fraction of a second of impatience could provoke unknown dangers. The presence beneath the waves pressed against the platform like a weight, quiet but undeniable, reminding me why the rule existed. Hours stretched on, each movement calibrated within the automated depth limit, each adjustment measured with extreme care. The ocean's rhythm, the subtle sway of the platform, and the pulsing vibrations from below all demanded respect. Rule 8 had transformed from an instruction into a survival mantra, a tether keeping me and Torres aligned with safety. We exchanged few words, understanding that communication beyond gestures might disturb the fragile balance. Every motion, every glance, every conscious restraint reinforced the principle that deep would not be challenged without consequence. By the middle of the night, fatigue pressed heavily on both of us, but the rule remained non-negotiable. The automated limit was more than a mechanical safeguard. It was a boundary between safety and the unknowable. I felt the crane respond almost like a living extension of the platform, its tension echoing the intelligence lurking in the water below. Every careful inch we gained reinforced the importance of patience, vigilance, and adherence to Rule 8. We were at the mercy of forces beyond our comprehension, and disobedience could rip control from our hands in a heartbeat. The weight of responsibility pressed on my shoulders, reminding me of the fragile line we walked above the abyss. The crane's cable hung taut against the dark water, and the memory of Rule 9, never ignore the pressure gauges, no matter how stable they appear, surged into my mind like a sudden icy wind. The platform creaked under the subtle swells, each vibration mirrored in the faint hum of the gauges across the control panel. I could feel the weight of the load above stretching the cable, the tension pressing back through the controls. And yet I knew that even when the numbers looked normal, there was always something lurking beneath the surface that the instruments might not immediately reveal. Rule 9 wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline, a way to read the hidden signals the ocean sent through steel and water. Torres leaned over my shoulder, eyes scanning the gauges in tandem with me. "They look fine," he said quietly, though I could feel his tension matching my own. I shook my head slightly, recalling previous nights when stability had been deceiving, when small deviations invisible to the casual observer had triggered disasters. The ocean below was patient, intelligent, and subtle. The gauges reflected a fraction of its presence, a surface indicator of forces we couldn't comprehend directly. Rule 9 required vigilance and intuition, trusting the instruments, but never letting them lull you into a false sense of security. I moved along the control panel carefully, tracing each dial, each needle, and each flicker of light. The numbers seemed ordinary at first glance, steady and reassuring, but my instincts told me to pay attention to the slight micro-fluctuations, almost imperceptible shifts that suggested hidden forces. The crane's load above felt alive, tugging slightly with a rhythm that seemed to pulse in response to something far below the surface. Rule 9 demanded that I monitor these tiny variations, the subtle language of machinery translating the ocean's will. Every operator before me, who ignored these hints, had disappeared or returned hollowed by the deep. As the night deepened, the platform seemed to breathe under the influence of the ocean's currents, transmitting subtle vibrations through steel beams and bolts. I felt each tremor, each pulse of pressure, as though the water itself communicated through the gauges. Torres and I moved slowly, deliberately, checking dials and needles multiple times, aware that Rule 9 required more than casual observation. Each micro-fluctuation could indicate a load stress, a hidden anomaly, or the presence of something unseen testing our equipment. Ignoring even the slightest variation could invite disaster, and I had no intention of testing the limits of the ocean's patience. Hours passed in tense vigilance, the gauges humming quietly beneath my hands. I traced every minute change, comparing it to previous measurements, feeling the cable above respond almost consciously to the hidden currents below. Rule 9 reminded me that stability was an illusion, that the ocean's intelligence extended to everything above it, from the tiniest micro-vibrations in a winch to the faintest fluctuation on a pressure dial. The platform itself seemed alive, resonating in response to both our movements and the unseen forces lurking beneath, and I realized that absolute attention was the only way to survive. Torres finally whispered, "I can't tell if that needle just shifted, or if I'm imagining it." I nodded grimly, understanding the doubt that haunted us both. Even the smallest uncertainty in the gauges demanded investigation, and Rule 9 dictated that we treat each anomaly seriously, no matter how insignificant it seemed. I adjusted the controls slightly, observing the response, feeling every vibration transmitted through the cable and the crane arm. Each careful motion reinforced the lesson: the ocean, the platform, and the instruments were intertwined, and the rule existed to prevent subtle shifts from turning into catastrophic events. The night wore on, and fatigue pressed heavily, but my eyes remained locked on the panel, tracking each needle's movement, each micro-indicator, and each subtle signal of stress in the system. The ocean's presence was unmistakable, a patient and intelligent force that probed our attention and discipline. Rule 9 had become more than a guideline. It was a measure of survival, forcing us to read the hidden language of steel, water, and tension. Every time a gauge twitched slightly, my heart raced, my hands adjusted, and I felt the enormity of ignoring such subtle warnings. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and deep water, and I realized that even the gauges themselves were not absolute. They required context, attention, and respect. I adjusted the crane again, following every variation in the pressure needles, ensuring that every micro-movement was accounted for. Rule 9 reminded me that appearances were often deceptive. Stability could hide danger, and only constant vigilance could keep catastrophe at bay. I could feel the presence beneath the platform, patient and assessing, and the gauges were our only interface with it, translating unseen forces into numbers we could comprehend, barely. By the early hours of the morning, the faint green and red lights on the panels had become hypnotic, pulsing in rhythm with the tension above and the subtle currents below. I leaned in, every sense alert, feeling the stress of the load above, the swaying of the platform, and the tiny, almost imperceptible deviations that the gauges reported. Rule 9 demanded a mental and physical discipline that tested both our patience and our fear. The ocean below remained silent but omnipresent, and the instruments were the only bridge between its intelligence and our survival. Ignoring them, even for a heartbeat, could allow forces we couldn't see to act with lethal efficiency. Hours continued to stretch, punctuated by micro-adjustments and constant observation. I moved my hands carefully along the controls, Torres mimicking my attention in perfect synchronicity. Each fluctuation in the gauges was analyzed, accounted for, and responded to in real time. Rule 9 had transformed into an almost meditative state of alertness, where the tension in my arms, the vibrations under my boots, and the numbers on the dials all formed a single language I had to understand to survive. The ocean, the platform, and our instruments were intertwined in a delicate balance, and every twitch of the gauges reminded me that vigilance was our only shield. By the time dawn broke, painting the deck with muted orange light, the tension in the platform and the load had eased slightly, but the lesson remained imprinted on my mind. Rule 9 had been relentless, demanding constant observation, unwavering discipline, and respect for the subtle forces that even the most sophisticated instruments could only hint at. I understood that survival depended not just on obeying the rule mechanically, but on feeling, anticipating, and respecting the unseen intelligence beneath the waves. Each gauge, each needle, each micro-fluctuation had been a lifeline, and ignoring them, even for a second, was unthinkable. The storm had rolled in unexpectedly, dark clouds masking the horizon, and the memory of Rule 10, never open the emergency hatch without a second person present, slammed into me, as though the ocean itself was reminding me of the dangers of solitude. The hatch sat at the edge of the deck, metal glinting faintly under the flickering lights, tempting yet forbidding. I had handled emergency procedures before, but this rule was different. It demanded companionship, vigilance, and coordination, recognizing that one person alone could not survive the unknown forces waiting just beneath the threshold. My instincts screamed caution, and I knew ignoring the rule could cost us everything. Torres stayed close, his shadow merging with mine as we approached the hatch together. "Do we really have to do this now?" he muttered, voice edged with unease. I nodded, feeling the tension pressing against my chest, knowing the ocean below had a patient awareness of every move we made. Rule 10 existed not to restrict action, but to ensure that when we crossed that line, we did it with full accountability. One operator alone might underestimate the subtle signals, miss the slight vibrations, or react too slowly. Two people ensured balance, safety, and the ability to respond to whatever awaited below. I placed my hand on the cold metal handle, feeling the vibrations of the deck beneath my palm. The storm intensified, wind lashing across the platform, making every step deliberate and precise. The hatch itself seemed to hum subtly, almost alive, as if sensing our attention. I glanced at Torres, who mirrored my hesitation, understanding the shared weight of responsibility. Rule 10 reminded me that this was no ordinary emergency exit. Opening it alone was an invitation to disaster. The ocean's patient intelligence lay just beneath the steel, testing our readiness, observing our restraint, and waiting for a lapse in vigilance. Minutes dragged as we coordinated our approach, every movement calculated. I could feel the tension in the platform, the subtle vibration of steel, and the rhythmic pulse of the waves below, as though they were warning us to act with care. Rule 10 was not just procedural, it was survival. The hatch opened slowly under our combined effort, metal groaning against its frame, echoing faintly in the surrounding night. I peered into the darkness, the faint sound of water lapping against the platform sending shivers down my spine. Torres and I exchanged a glance, both silently acknowledging that the ocean below watched, patient and intelligent, aware of our presence. The wind gusted harder, and the hatch trembled in my hands, testing our balance, our coordination, and our restraint. I reminded myself of the vanished operators, those who had ignored Rule 10, acting impulsively, alone. Their fate was a lesson we couldn't afford to repeat. Every step, every shift of weight, every cautious movement of the hatch demanded precision. The ocean beneath us pulsed invisibly, an intelligent presence gauging our adherence to the rule. Ignoring it was unthinkable, even momentarily. for the consequences could be instantaneous and deadly. We leaned together, adjusting our grip, and finally managed to pry the hatch open just enough to glimpse the darkness below. A faint mist rose from the opening, carrying the scent of salt, machinery, and something unidentifiable, something alive. Rule 10 reinforced the need for a second set of eyes and hands, one to operate, one to observe, one to catch the first sign of danger. The water beneath the platform seemed patient yet aware, testing the limits of our discipline. Every vibration of the deck resonated with tension, reminding us that the abyss was never indifferent, and the smallest lapse could trigger disaster. Torres whispered, "Are you seeing this?" His voice was tense but low, recognizing the shared responsibility imposed by the rule. I nodded, not taking my eyes from the hatch. The darkness below seemed almost tangible, pressing upward against the metal, as if the deep water itself had a consciousness. Rule 10 demanded cooperation, vigilance, and mutual trust, because the ocean could exploit any hesitation, any division between operators. Our survival depended not only on adherence to procedure, but on our ability to act as a single unit under pressure, resisting the pull of the unknown. Hours passed with the hatch partially open, the storm raging around us, making every sound exaggerated, every shadow suspicious. I could feel my muscles tighten from strain, my mind focused entirely on the smallest movements of the hatch, the wind and the ocean beneath. Rule 10 kept me grounded, reminding me that alone, I would be vulnerable to forces that could shift the deck, sway the crane, or pull the hatch open entirely. Together, Torres and I maintained perfect coordination, silently acknowledging that our lives depended on discipline, patience, and the awareness of the ocean's intelligent gaze. By midnight, the storm had abated slightly, leaving a tense calm over the platform, but the hatch remained a focal point of anxiety and vigilance. I observed every slight creak, every subtle movement in the metal frame, and the faint vibration from the water below, aware that these signals were testing our adherence to Rule 10. The ocean was patient, but it measured every hesitation, every adjustment, every moment we followed the rule precisely. One lapse, one impulsive act, could invite consequences that were immediate, overwhelming, and impossible to escape. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, I allowed a small exhale, not of relief, but of continued vigilance. The hatch remained open only as much as we controlled it, the storm subsiding, but the weight of the rule pressing heavily in my mind. Rule 10 had reinforced the necessity of partnership, observation, and restraint when confronting forces beyond comprehension. I realized that our survival depended on this shared responsibility, the ocean's patient observation, and our absolute adherence to the rule that forbade acting alone when the unknown waited just beneath the threshold. The platform was quiet, eerily so, with only the gentle sway of the waves beneath and the faint hum of machinery, when the weight of Rule 11 never signaled the deep lights, unless absolutely necessary, hit me like a thunderclap. Those lights, meant to illuminate and mark the platform for safety, were not mere indicators. They were invitations, beacons for something ancient, patient, and intelligent lurking in the abyss. The ocean below seemed to react even to my thoughts, pressing up against the steel deck with an invisible weight. I remembered every warning, every vanished operator, every whispered story, and I knew that obeying Rule 11 was the difference between surviving another day or becoming a cautionary tale. Torres and I moved cautiously across the deck, our eyes flicking to the deep lights, knowing that activating them could provoke forces we were ill-prepared to confront. "Do we even need them on tonight?" he asked, voice barely a whisper, tense as if the ocean itself could hear him. I shook my head, understanding that the rule was absolute. These lights were not just for visibility, they were signals to something that existed beyond human comprehension, something that measured restraint, patience, and adherence. Rule 11 demanded discipline beyond mechanics. It required the intelligence to recognize that curiosity, no matter how tempting, could be fatal. The storm from the previous night had left the platform slick, and every step felt deliberate, echoing faintly across the metal. The deep lights glowed faintly, their presence almost hypnotic, and I resisted the urge to manipulate the controls. I felt the ocean beneath us, vast and patient, aware of every small motion we made. Rule 11 existed because the lights carried a duality. They could warn, but they could also lure, attracting something that fed on impulsive operators. I remembered the last operator who had ignored the rule, believing he was simply signaling for help. He had vanished without a trace, leaving only an eerie silence behind. Hours passed with the lights untouched, yet their glow reflected in the water below, seeming to pulse in recognition of our restraint. Every shadow, every creak of the platform, Every subtle vibration of steel and cable demanded vigilance. I monitored the controls, the crane, and the deck, resisting any thought of using the deep lights. Rule 11 reminded me that survival here wasn't about force or quick fixes. It was about patience, observation, and obedience. One impulsive activation could draw attention from the abyss, from something that was patient, intelligent, and far beyond our comprehension. Torres occasionally glanced at the lights, his expression a mix of fascination and fear. "They almost seem alive," he whispered. I nodded silently, understanding that the lights were more than mechanical indicators. They were a bridge between our world and the intelligence beneath the waves. Rule 11 demanded we recognize the weight of this connection, that signaling recklessly could invite an encounter we were unprepared for. The ocean, dark and patient, seemed to lean closer with every moment of hesitation, testing our restraint, measuring our discipline, and observing our every micro-movement. The night dragged on, tension thick in the air. Every vibration through the deck, every subtle sway of the platform, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified in importance. The ocean's presence was undeniable, its patience relentless. Rule 11 echoed in my mind like a heartbeat, reminding me that even when it seemed safe, the deep lights were not ours to control lightly. We moved with deliberate caution, ensuring no accidental activation occurred, our hands steady, our thoughts focused, knowing that the abyss below observed not just our actions, but the intent behind them. At one point, I imagined the possibility of using the lights to test the depth sensors, to see if anything lurked below the platform. My instincts screamed against it, recalling every operator's story, every vanished colleague, every whispered warning. Rule 11 restrained my curiosity, enforcing the discipline that had kept us alive through storms, glowing creatures, and mechanical failures. The ocean seemed to sense even the fleeting temptation, pressing its awareness against the hull, a reminder that patience and restraint were our only defenses against the unknown. Hours became an eternity as we monitored the platform and the crane, the tension in the cable above, and the subtle, intelligent pulse of the ocean below. The deep lights remained untouched, their glow faint but omnipresent. Rule 11 dictated that we act only when absolutely necessary, yet necessity was a fluid concept here, easily misinterpreted in the presence of forces beyond comprehension. The abyss was patient, infinitely patient, and our survival depended on our ability to respect boundaries, observe meticulously, and resist even the slightest temptation to signal for attention. Torres finally broke the silence, his voice barely audible. "It's like they're watching, waiting." I didn't respond, aware that any acknowledgement of the light's presence could amplify their effect. Rule 11 reminded me that our lives were precarious, balanced on the edge of obedience, vigilance, and restraint. The deep lights were more than a safety measure. They were an interface with something intelligent, patient, and potentially lethal. Activating them unnecessarily would not only break the rule, it could provoke an encounter from which there was no return. As dawn approached, the first faint light touched the horizon, reflecting softly on the steel deck and the dark water beyond. The deep lights glimmered faintly, untouched, yet their presence was a constant reminder of the ocean's patient awareness. Rule 11 had preserved our lives through the night, but I could feel the tension lingering, the weight of the abyss pressing just below the surface. Even with the rule obeyed, the intelligence below remained, silent, patient, and ever-present, leaving me to wonder if survival was ever truly guaranteed. The crane, the platform, the water, and the lights formed an intricate, unbreakable network, and I realized that the ocean's vigilance was eternal. The hatch, the crane, the winches, and the deep lights all whispered the same message. Obedience, patience, and restraint were the only paths to another day. Rule 11, like the others, had guided us, restrained us, and protected us, but the ocean below did not rest, did not forgive, and did not forget. Its presence was palpable, and even as the first rays of sunlight broke the horizon, I could feel it watching, waiting, measuring our every action. Survival had been achieved, yes, but at a cost, an understanding that the abyss is patient, intelligent, and eternal, and that someday it will demand attention again. The platform creaked under the morning light, a faint vibration traveling through my arms as I exhaled slowly, but the intelligence beneath the waves remained. Rule 11 had kept us alive for the night, but I knew the ocean's gaze would never waver, and its patience was infinite. Some rules, I realized, were not just procedural, they were contracts with something older, deeper, and far beyond human understanding. Even with every rule obeyed, the abyss waits, and the lights remain, silently pulsing, ready for the moment when curiosity or impatience breaks the fragile line of survival. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.